Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this revision lesson. The topic is troubles at home and abroad. The focus today is conflict with Spain. Really interesting topic, this one. We're going to be looking at the relationship between Elizabeth I and Spain during her rule, how increasingly the relationship became tense, the background to the conflict with Spain, what actually happened. We're going to be looking obviously in detail at naval warfare, and in particular we're going to be looking at the events of 1588 and the reasons behind the defeat of the Spanish Armada, and also looking at the significance of that and what happened afterwards in that conflict with Spain. So let's find out more about England's conflict with Spain during the Elizabethan era. Let's go. Okay, so we're on the topic of troubles at home and abroad, and we're going to be looking at the conflict with Spain today, what happened during the Spanish Armada, and then ultimately the key question, why did the Armada fail in 1588? So what caused the conflict with Spain? So a little bit of timeline here for you, and a focus on Philip of Spain and who he was. So King Philip II of Spain, he married Mary I of England in 1554 and had become very powerful in England during the rule of Queen Mary. He became the King of Spain himself in 1556. And then in 1559, he made a marriage proposal to Elizabeth I, but this was rejected. And he becomes a thorn in Elizabeth's side, really, increasingly, especially when Mary Queen of Scots comes back to England in 1568. He's sort of implicated variously in the different plots, etc. 1587, an important event is the singeing of the king's beard when the Spanish town of Cadiz is attacked by Francis Drake. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Spanish Armada failed in 1588, and Philip himself died on the 13th of September 1598. And you can see there how powerful Philip was. I mean, for example, when he was in England from 1554, his head appeared on English coins alongside Mary. He had various titles in his life. He was obviously the King of Spain, but also the King of Portugal from 1580 to 1598, the Duke of Milan, and the King of Naples and Sicily. So a very powerful person. He was very much the most powerful person in Europe during this time. There's absolutely no doubt about that. So what causes the conflict with Spain? So England and Spain, at the start of Elizabeth's rule, England and Spain were allies and were actually fighting against France. But gradually, throughout Elizabeth's rule, the relationship with Spain worsens. And I suppose the rejection of the marriage proposal can start things off on the wrong foot, really. But tensions grew basically with Spain being Catholic and England being Protestant. And then Spanish involvement in those different Catholic plots, the Rodolphi, Throckmorton and Babington plot, the Spanish ambassadors such as Despares and Mendoza had been expelled from England as a result of those Catholic plots. And Philip is broadly angry about how English Catholics are being treated during this time. So that's one of the long-term factors. The other long-term factor is around piracy. So Philip is angry and humiliated by the attacks from English sailors on his treasure ships, particularly from people like Francis Drake and John Hawkins. This very much accelerates into the 1570s and the 1580s, and you've got things like Francis Drake's circumnavigation of the world between 1577 and 1580. Another cause of the conflict with Spain is a rebellion in the Netherlands. So the Spanish ruled the Netherlands during this time as part of the Spanish Empire, but Protestants in the Netherlands were rebelling. And this rebellion spelt danger for Elizabeth, because if the Protestant rebellion failed and the Spanish took complete control of the Netherlands, then it meant that a strong Spanish army would be very close to England. It was also affecting English cloth trade in Antwerp, which had largely kind of closed and had caused poverty and unemployment in England. So England had been sending money to the Dutch rebels and allowing their ships to dock in English ports, and it's kind of unofficially been supporting the rebels in the Netherlands without actually formally being at war with Spain. Now, everything changed in 1584 when the Dutch Protestant rebel leader, who was called William of Orange, was assassinated. Now, this changed things because it caused a huge problem for the Dutch Protestant rebels and meant that the Dutch Protestant rebels needed more direct support from England, really. Now, also at this time, the Spanish signed a peace treaty with France called the Treaty of Joinville, and that again is a problem for England because previously England had been able to quite nicely play France and Spain off against one another, and Elizabeth had been able to stay out of wars. Elizabeth was very anti-war. She thought the war was expensive and a waste of resources, and therefore she tried to avoid wars during her rule. However, Elizabeth was forced to sign the Treaty of Nonsuch with the Dutch Protestant rebels, and under this agreement, Elizabeth sent an army of 7,000 English soldiers to help the Dutch rebels under the command of Robert Dudley. And Philip saw this as an act of war, and from about 1585, England and Spain are essentially at war with each other. In 1585, Francis Drake began to attack towns controlled by Spain in the Caribbean. So Philip is angry about this, and he starts to plan for an armada to send a fleet of ships. And we'll look at what the actual plan for the Spanish Armada is in just a moment. Obviously, as well, the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, is a short-term cause of the Armada kind of coming to England, because her execution made it likely that you would need a more direct invasion to actually bring Catholicism into England. A lot of the plots had focused on simply killing Elizabeth I, and then therefore having Mary, Queen of Scots in place to be the heir to the throne. So if we look at this diagram, it kind of gives us a good overview of the conflict with Spain. We've got religion, rebellion in the Netherlands, and the plots, the privateers, and the persecution as some of the longer-term consequences. But the triggers to actually what causes the conflict with Spain and the Spanish sending over their armada in 1588 is the Treaty of Joinville, which meant that Spain didn't have to worry about being at war with France, so could concentrate their efforts on attacking the English. The Dutch rebellion being crushed by the Duke of Parma and the rebel leader being assassinated, William of Orange, meant that Elizabeth had to give more direct support to the Protestant Netherlands, putting England and Spain more at conflict with each other. And then obviously the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots as well. There's just a little bit of a focus there, and a picture of the Dutch rebel leader, William of Orange, sometimes known as William the Silent, because he tended to remain silent on different issues. So, in terms of naval warfare, let's have a look at the two sides. So you need to be aware of the two different sides in this conflict between the Spanish and English. So the English forces in the Armada were commanded by Lord Howard of Effingham, and the Spanish forces were commanded by the Duke of Medina Sidonia. So in terms of the leadership, one of the things to be aware of with the Spanish is that the Duke of Medina Sidonia wasn't actually the original commander, so he was a bit of a last-minute draft in to be the commander. And although he was effective in military matters, he was more known for being more effective on land than at sea. But his commanders that he had underneath him were experienced. The English fleet was led by Lord Howard, the deputy was Sir Francis Drake, and he also had commanders like John Hawkins, Martin Frobisher, that were experienced sailors. So in terms of the leadership, the overall leadership of the English was probably superior to the Spanish. In terms of resources, and you can pause that and read the actual stats in more detail, but the Spanish had a lot more resources. So Philip's annual income was £3 million, whereas Elizabeth's annual income was 300,000. So the Spanish had a lot more resources. The Armada had 64 battleships. The English had 54 battleships. So the Spanish had more resources within this battle, if you like. In terms of the tactics, so the plan for the Spanish was for the Armada to sail to the Netherlands to meet up with an army which was led by Philip's best general, who was called the Duke of Parma. And then the role of the Armada, it's very important you realise this, the Armada is not an invasion force itself. The Armada is basically there to escort this army that's commanded by the Duke of Parma, this huge army, it's about 27,000 soldiers, isn't it? To escort them over the channel to make sure that they can safely get across the channel. And the idea is that the Duke of Parma's army would be transported on these basically what are like flat bottom barges, really. They would have crossed the channel and landed in Kent, and the Armada was designed to protect them. So the English plan was to destroy the enemy ships from a distance. Now the Spanish, when they used to fight at sea, normally used to basically have these big boats and used to get close to their enemy, and then they used to use grappling hooks to board the ships, and then they would use sort of hand-to-hand fighting. The English, however, under John Hawkins, had redesigned their navy. So John Hawkins becomes Lord Treasurer of the English Navy from 1578, and he redesigns the English navy and makes the boats much more maneuverable, much faster, with long-range guns. So the tactics of the English is to not get too close to the Spanish, but actually fire at them and destroy their boats from a distance. In terms of technology and weapons, the Spanish had lots of guns and plenty of ammunition, but their guns wouldn't fire quickly enough, so they could only fire 1 or 2 rounds a day, and they struggled to fire frequently. Whereas John Hawkins, as we've said, he redesigned the English Navy, a new fleet of 24 newly designed race-built warships, so they could go really, really fast. They had 2,000 cannon and smaller guns, but the key thing with the English guns is they were light and could be fired quickly. So the plan was the Armada would set sail from Spain, go to Calais, where it would meet up with an army from the Spanish Netherlands, led by the Duke of Parma. As I've said, the Armada would protect the Parma's troops as they crossed the Channel on barges. And the idea would be to set up a temporary government led by Cardinal Allen, who at the time was the leader of the English Catholics. So the plan basically is to restore Catholicism to England. That's the plan of the Spanish Armada. Now, one of the crucial events to be aware of is that in April 1587, just a couple of months after the execution of Mary Queen of Scots, Francis Drake carries out an attack which is known as the Singeing of the King's Beard, and this attack takes place on Cadiz in April 1587. Now, what's interesting to note is that Philip was actually planning the Spanish Armada to take place in 1587, but what happens is Drake's attack destroys 24 Spanish ships and destroys a lot of their supplies, including quite a lot of their barrels that they could have used to transport some of their food supplies and water supplies they needed. And then Drake then sent a force to the Azores to capture Spanish treasure ships, which caused the Spanish fleet to have to go and protect their treasure fleets, and this delayed the invasion by 1 year. So this is quite a crucial event, the Singeing of the King's Beard, and important that you understand that in terms of the chronology of the Spanish Armada. So the main events of the Spanish Armada, so it would have taken place in 1587, but it didn't because of the Singeing of the King's Beard. The Spanish Armada left Lisbon in 1588, May 1588, but it very quickly ran into storms, lost supplies, had to regroup, but it sailed down the west coast of France in this very distinctive crescent formation. Now, the slower unarmed galleons and store ships were well protected in the middle. So although there's around about 130 boats in the Spanish Armada, only about 64 of those are actually battleships. The rest of them are basically transport ships, and they're storing, men and supplies and that type of thing. So they're not armed, so they can't be used in battle, those ships. By the 29th of July, the Spanish Armada sails into the English Channel in the crescent formation, and the English fleet chased them using long-distance cannon to fire at them, but no serious damage at that stage was done at all. So, what happened next? On the 6th of August, the Armada reached Calais, and the Duke of Parma and his troops were only about 50 kilometres away, but they were being attacked by the Dutch Protestant rebels. Now, one of the crucial events, and if you get an answer where you need to talk about why the Armada was defeated, this is a crucial event. So Lord Howard, who's the commander of the English forces, he decides to fill 8 unmanned English ships with tar, gunpowder, etc. And these ships were set alight and allowed to drift into the harbour at Calais. Now, these fire ships took place at night, would look very dramatic, caused the Spanish sailors to panic, and they cut anchor out of the harbour and they sailed out of the harbour. Now, strong winds at the time as well meant that this scattered the Spanish fleet, it ruined their crescent formation, and they were blown towards sandbanks off the Dutch coast. So the fire ships is the start of everything going wrong for the Spanish. Now, on the 8th of August, at dawn on the 8th of August, the crucial battle of the Spanish Armada takes place. It's called the Battle of Gravelines. And basically, Lord Howard orders the English ships to attack, and the battle's in rough seas. And basically, the English are able to win this battle because the Spanish aren't able to get close enough to board the English ships. So the English are firing, and they're firing what are known as broadsides. They're firing their cannons at the Spanish boats, but from a long distance. The Spanish don't have the same long distance powerful guns, so they're not able to do that much damage. And you can see there, this is a huge victory. 1,000 Spanish sailors are killed, 800 wounded, with only about 50 English sailors were killed. So this tactic, the fact that the English boats are smaller, very maneuverable, they've got these long-range effective guns that can be reloaded quickly, basically makes these Spanish and these big heavy ships, basically makes them like sitting ducks in terms of just being taken out by the English. And the battle is a huge overwhelming victory for the English. The 9th of August, the Armada goes north, what's left of the Armada. The wind changed direction, forced the Armada to sail into the North Sea. The English fleet chased it for 2 days until the Armada sailed past the Scottish border, which obviously therefore is beyond the English territory. Elizabeth still feared that the Duke of Parma would attack, so she travelled to Tilbury in Essex, where 4,000 soldiers were guarding the coast there and protecting London, and that's where she delivered her very famous speech. I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England too, and think foul scorn that Parma or Spain or any prince of Europe should dare to invade the borders of my realm. One of the most famous speeches that Elizabeth made during her reign. So you can see there the map. The Armada, September to October 1588, sailed around Scotland and Ireland. The weather played havoc with them. Gales and strong winds caused lots of shipwrecks. The Spanish lost a further 50 ships, so only about 80 ships made it back to Spain, with about 20,000 Spanish sailors and soldiers being killed. So the consequences, well, humiliating for Philip. Elizabeth made the most of it in terms of her propaganda. We know about the very famous Armada portrait. The northern part of the Netherlands became independent, which helped English trade. Elizabeth presented it as a victory for the Protestant religion over Catholicism. It's probably, I think, the peak of the Elizabethan era. This is the sort of victory we talked about in other videos about how the 1590s everything started to kind of fade for Elizabeth. It's worth noting that only a month after this victory, we saw the death of Robert Dudley, who died in September 1588. In terms of the consequences of the war, Philip prepared further armadas, and the Anglo-Spanish War continued. So it didn't end that war, and that's important for you to know. There were further skirmishes in 1589, 1596, 1597. In 1601, a Spanish army landed in Ireland to support the Catholic rebels, and the war with Spain was only ended at the Treaty of London in 1604. The other thing to consider is that preparing for the Spanish Armada had been hugely expensive. You know, Elizabeth never wanted wars because she knew that they were expensive and damaging, and that's true. And the war had to be paid for. It led to increased taxes, it caused inflation, and it caused hardship. It's one of the reasons why there was so much poverty in England in the 1590s, that combined with those poor harvests. And of course, stricter laws were introduced against Catholics as well. So in summary, the main consequences were political, economic, religious, and military consequences. So political in terms of big propaganda base for Elizabeth, economic in terms of leading to huge amounts of poverty, religious in terms of England remaining Protestant and harsher laws against Catholics, and military, England is safer from invasion. The Netherlands is safer as well, part of that becoming independent from the Spanish rule, but the Anglo-Spanish War continues until 1604. So if you get a causation focus on why the Spanish Armada was defeated, clearly the English strengths are absolutely crucial. Their superior shipbuilding, their manoeuvrability of the ships, the long-range guns and weapons they had, the tactics they were able to use, the firing of the broadsides. These are all great English strengths. The Spanish obviously had weaknesses, so they lacked experience. The Duke of Medina Sidonia wasn't an experienced naval commander, for example. The Spanish showed inexperience in dealing with the fire ships and allowing their fleet to be scattered and abandoning that strong crescent formation. The Spanish plan to meet the Duke of Parma was flawed. The Spain didn't control a deep water port where the Armada could safely anchor, which meant the ships were very vulnerable to attack whilst waiting for Parma's troops. There's a little bit of luck as well. So the admiral who was supposed to command the Armada, Santa Cruz, he died in February 1588. The weather caused problems as well. The weather meant that the Spanish couldn't kind of come back after the Battle of Gravelines because they were basically trapped in the North Sea and forced to return to go north. But I think, a combination of these factors is absolutely crucial. Certainly at the time, a lot was made of the weather being the divine intervention from God and being a sign that God favoured Protestantism rather than Catholicism. So we've learned about the conflict with Spain, we've learned about the reasons behind it, the key events of the Spanish Armada, the key tactics involved in naval warfare during that time, and the technology, and crucially, the consequence of the Spanish Armada, and evaluation of the reasons why the Armada was defeated. So thanks for listening, hope you enjoyed that, and goodbye.